Hey, let me just give you an intro to the Gospel of Mark in case later on in the series you want just kind of the background information. The Gospel of Mark was written by a man named John Mark. We just know him as Mark, who was not a super prominent leader in the New Testament church, but one that finds himself in a lot of key areas. His mother, Mary, was a prominent widow, prominent follower of Jesus, who owned a large home in the city of Jerusalem. It was a place where a lot of different things were going on in the early church gathered. What that tells us is that Mark was an eyewitness of many of the things that he writes about. He went along with Barnabas and Paul on the first missionary journey and actually bailed on them in the middle of the trip, which led to a disagreement between Paul and Barnabas that eventually got patched up, and John was restored. And toward the end of his life, he actually acted as a scribe to the Apostle Peter. And so most scholars think that the Gospel of Mark is in a lot of ways Mark's rendition of writing down the message that Peter would speak about Jesus, the stories that Peter would tell about Jesus. And yet he does so with a very interesting flavor, with a very purposeful and directional thought. He writes down the stories about Jesus for a very specific purpose. And he tells us right away in chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So basically, the beginning of the good news of Jesus, who is the Messiah, Jesus, who is the Christ, who also happens to be divine. He is the Son of God. Now, what Mark does then, after this explicit statement of why he's writing, and so that you would realize that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, is that he essentially goes on radio silence for 8 chapters. Says nothing more editorially about who he thinks Jesus is, simply tells the stories, lays out the miracles of Jesus and his interactions with his disciples and the crowds, so that people would be able to ask the question, who is this guy? Why did he come? What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? And then in chapter 8, kind of the entire hinge point of the book, at the end of Jesus' Galilee ministry, Jesus asks Peter, who do you say that I am? And Peter blurts out, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And so everything's kind of building to this point, and then everything turns at that point. At that point, Jesus begins to head toward Jerusalem, that he now indeed is the Christ, the Son of God. And he begins to talk a lot more about dying and laying down his life for the sins of humanity. There's 3 chapters of essentially the road or the pathway to Jerusalem. And then the last number of chapters are all about Jesus' final week. Now, the book hits a climactic point at the end of chapter 15, almost a very abrupt ending. It doesn't really deal with the resurrection a whole lot at all, because the apostles, many of them were still alive, and they were to bear witness to the resurrection. But the least likely person in the world to recognize Jesus, the Roman guard who is executing him on the cross, when the sky goes dark and Jesus gives up his life, he blurts out, surely this was the Son of God. And that's Mark's point, that Jesus is the Messiah, that his coming is good news, and that he also is the Son of God. And so Mark is constantly putting before us, who do you say that he is? Who is Jesus? What does it mean to follow Jesus? And why did Jesus ultimately come? It was to give his life as ransom for many.